A new world order is emerging that will decide whether we have a world of limitless opportunity or a world without freedom. That's the warning from my next guest, who says this new digital order is being shaped by big tech companies. Ian Bremmer is president and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. He is in New York. Ian Bremmer, it's good to talk to you again.
Good to see you.
On this program, we've talked a lot about the global security order and the global economic order, but not much about the global technology order that you argue is emerging now. What does that look like in your view?
Well, it's driven by technology companies. We're used to geopolitics and our world being driven by governments. But when we talk about the technology space, governments do not have the expertise. They don't have the institutions. They don't have the ability, at least not for the near future, to be driving the bus. And so what that means is a very small number of very wealthy, very powerful men that run these companies, these tech companies that are driving the rollout of artificial intelligence, are actually making the decisions about how AI will play out in the economy, in security, in our political space, and as we identify as human beings.
Yeah, and you argue in your new Tech Talk that this order, driven by these rich men as you describe it, it's going to decide whether we have a world of limitless opportunity or a world without freedom. Those are quite the stark outcomes. How can you expand on that?
Sure. I mean, look, on the one hand, I'm quite an enthusiast when it comes to artificial intelligence. I believe that the ability of anyone online to have access to world-class education and healthcare, and the driving this is going to do for advances in pretty much every scientific field over the next 5-10 years is far greater than what we saw in the heights of globalization. So it is going to drive enormous wealth and productivity, and that's a really exciting thing. On the other hand, it is also driving extraordinary disinformation. It's allowing tinkerers and bad actors to have access to things that would, radically improve the creation of malware, the creation of bioweapons, lethal autonomous drones. I mean, we all know that it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people, and guns just make it easier. AI takes that exponentially greater. And even if companies were prepared to self-regulate, and they're not, because they're spending all of their time and money just to try to build those advances as fast as possible so the other company doesn't get there first. But even if they were trying to self-regulate, you'd still have all of these new algorithms in the hands of lots of people, some of whom want to do good things with them, and some of whom don't. And that's happening at the same time. Maybe the easiest way for me to explain it is when we had globalization and all of this incredible growth for 50 years, we also had climate change. And there are consequences of the same basic drivers of we had all this growth and we all benefited, but then we had all of this carbon in the atmosphere and nobody wanted to pay for that, which means that you and me and our kids pay for it. AI is doing all of that at the same time, and a hell of a lot faster, not over 50 years, but over like 50 months. And we're just not ready for that.
Well, you mentioned the companies competing with each other. There's also the power struggles between the great powers, right? China and the U.S. You see this playing out in the tech domain, whether it's on semiconductors, banning Huawei from critical infrastructure, even something as simple as TikTok maybe being banned in the United States. So how does that struggle between the two great powers kind of affect the emergence of this global tech order?
Well, first, it makes it much harder to create a global response. I mean, climate change, we're all living in the same ball. We all understand we're breathing the same air. We're affected by the same global warming and global weirding. So we need to take carbon out of the atmosphere. We need to move to post-carbon energy. When it comes to AI, the fact that the Americans and Chinese are trying to beat each other and contain each other makes it a lot harder. And of course, U.S. export controls on semiconductors for the very chips that the Chinese need to use for advances in artificial intelligence means that there's no coordination, especially if you think about how these weapons, these tools might be used as weapons. I mean, China's building another 1,500 nuclear warheads with enriched uranium from Russia. We don't have a single arms agreement on nukes with the Chinese. Now you're talking about AI. You think we're going to sit down and talk with them about that? It makes it a lot harder. But I go back to my earlier point, which is still overwhelmingly the actors that are driving how artificial intelligence is deployed and used and profited from is really not the US government and the Chinese government, at least not yet. For now, it's actually these corporations.
So how do you confront that? I mean, we've come together on climate change with the international panels to come up with plans, and there is a mutual cooperation there. But as you mentioned, the competitive nature between the U.S. and China, for example, makes that unlikely. And you can't even get agreement at forums like the G7 and the G20 on how to tax the big tech companies. How do you contain this sort of artificial intelligence revolution they're driving?
Well, one is that you make people aware of it. I mean, 6 months ago, there wasn't a single head of state that I was speaking with that was asking me about AI. Today, every single one is, and the head of the IMF, and the head of the World Bank, and the Secretary General of the UN. So the fact that they are now focused because they understand that AI impacts their priorities, impacts the future of democracy, the future of capitalism, the future of the US-China relationship, does focus the mind. Now, I'm not pretending that we're going to get strong AI governance just on the basis of them paying attention, but you want them gaining expertise, understanding what the problems are, starting to recognize what they would want to do so that when the first crisis or crises hit, maybe with an election, maybe, God forbid, with a pathogen, maybe with a market collapse that's AI driven, then there's going to be a response. And you want that response to be from a number of actors that have already been thinking about what the challenges are and what they'd like to do, right? And you want it to be more like climate change. You want them doing the right things, heading in the right direction. You don't want it like the pandemic, where the response to the pandemic is disinformation and partisanship and blaming each other in the United States, or the US versus China, where the CDC today is actually a weaker institution, a less legitimate institution than it was before the pandemic hit. Nobody wants that with AI. That would be a very bad outcome.
So, but given its potential, and its potential to be weaponized and used, I mean, do you think we end up with a collective response, or do we end up with sort of a digital arms race between some of the countries?
Well, right now, we have a digital arms race primarily between the corporations and secondarily between the companies. That is the trajectory of play. That's the momentum right now. But that's not sustainable. We're not going to be there in 5 or 10 years. If we are, we're in very serious trouble. And part of the reason why I'm raising this, I mean, I'm spending probably more of my time right now on understanding the geopolitics of artificial intelligence and what that means in the policy realm, because I've got a platform and people will listen to me on this issue. So I think we need to do this. I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, I would have been, if I were in the same position, I would have been spending a lot more time on climate change. And I'm glad that a lot of people did that, because we now have more people investing in EVs, electric vehicles, and critical minerals, supply chain, and solar, and next generation nuclear. Thank God, right? Because, I mean, it's already late. Well, we need to be doing that today on AI. That is the point. If you ask me right now where I think we're going to be heading, the answer is completely uncertain. This is an almost virtually greenfield space, but it is not a sustainable trajectory.